Whoa, what is going on, football fans? Back at it with another New York Giants video. How's your Monday treating you, Giants fans? I know a lot of you guys are still probably down in the dumps or kind of emotionless. You don't know how to react after what took place yesterday as the New York Giants had their first tie, I think, in like 25 years. Ironically enough, against the same team the last time it happened against Washington. Of course, then they were called the Skins. Now, since then, they've changed their name to Commanders. And it was a huge game. I went into that game talking about how that was a must-win game. And in reality, and we're going to jump into the video, what that meant for the playoff possibilities. I probably should have labeled it more of a must not lose situation. Because by tying, even though it may not feel like it, as far as playoff purposes go, it was almost as if the New York Giants won that game. And I'll talk about the reasoning as to why I'm saying that throughout this video. Obviously, we gave that game away. And I think it showed a lot of the vulnerabilities of this football team. They're still young. They're still learning how to play in high-pressured situations. But the New York Giants absolutely gave that game away. They started off really bad, down 10-0, and then it looked great. We were dominating up at the point of attack on both sides of the ball. The Giants had 4 straight possessions in which they put up points. The offense probably looked the best they have all year over that 4-series stretch. I could be wrong. I'd have to go back and look at it. I don't know if the Giants have had 4 straight scores all year. It might be multiple years. I mean, we all know they didn't put up a whole lot of points with Joe Judge. That's something maybe I'll be interested to go in and look at. But the offense certainly looked good during that stretch. They were able to run the ball. Obviously, the defense created a turnover opportunity for one of those touchdowns with the fumble created by Azeez Ojulari on the 20-yard line. But they were able to run the ball. Daniel Jones was using his legs properly. Saquon Barkley, I think, had like 60 yards at the half or right around there. Couldn't do much in the second half. I think we had like 110 yards, 115 yards rushing in the first half. We finished with 135, including an overtime period. So we could get no push up at the point of attack. In terms of the ground game, I thought Jones played well outside of the fumble. I thought he played pretty well when you really think about it. And I posted it on Twitter. He made a play to win the game. And then John Feliciano committed the penalty because we would have been at like the 33 at that point with a first down, already up 7. So you're already in field goal range for Graham Gano. So he won the game there. Then he threw the ball to Darius Slayton that Darius Slayton clearly dropped. I know people are trying to stick up for Darius Slayton on Twitter, and I'm not destroying Darius Slayton. I think he's done as good of a job as you can hope for this year for the Giants, but it really points to just how bad this wide receiving core is. Because if you're being honest with yourself, a guy that is second in the NFL since he's entered the league with over a 15% drop rate, and a guy who was a 12% drop rate this year, that tells you all you need to know if he's your number one option in the passing game. So that's something that the New York Giants certainly got to work on in the offseason. And I posted a stat before the game started that the Giants drop a ball on 1 out of every 15.8 pass attempts for Daniel Jones. That's an insane number. Just look around the league. I posted on Twitter. Geno Smith, to put it in context, 1 out of every 43 passes. That's nearly triple, right? So we need to get Daniel Jones, and or even if he's not the quarterback, we got to get the quarterback a lot more help next year. And I think this just further emphasized it with that Slayton drop. I think Slayton had a really good game outside of that, but he had a huge drop in the key moment. And the Giants gave that game away. There was certainly a lot of questionable decisions, whether it be with the coaching staff. I didn't like Dable's timeout at the end of that game in overtime, the last time out he used. I didn't like Kafka's play design with the last play before the half when we ran with Daniel Jones on a 3rd and 1 with 20 seconds left and no timeouts. Might as well just kick the field goal at that point. I didn't like the second pass after the Slayton drop where they threw another very low percentage ball on a 2nd and 10. So, and then you had the mix-up with whatever that play was when you had Richie James and Saquon Barkley in the backfield on a huge 3rd down possession. So there was a lot of things in this game that gave Washington that opportunity. As good as the defense played, the defense certainly had some lapses as well. You go back and look, we had a 90-yard drive for the Washington to allow them to tie that game, to even send it to overtime, in which we gave up a 4th and 4 on their own 20-yard line. And I'm not going to rag on the defense. The defense kept us in that game, especially as the offense really started to fall off mid-3rd quarter on. And they did a great job in overtime as well. They basically had a goal line stand on that one possession for Washington at midfield, because had they gotten 5 or 6 more yards, they would have been in field goal range. And then they got off the field again when we pinned them deep inside their own 10-yard line to start out the drive, which gave Graham Gano that opportunity to kick the 58-yard field goal attempt in which he missed. But to me, that game was kind of like a roller coaster. It was up, it was down. There was good on the offensive side. Then it looked horrible. Defense, kind of similar. The defense was definitely the better overall unit than the offense throughout that game. The special teams was actually good. Probably the best the special teams has looked all year, outside of that one punt at the end of the game where Gillen only kicked it about 30 or 35 yards in the overtime period. But outside of that, I thought the special teams was really good in this contest. But some good, some bad. It was good to see a lot of the guys come back from injury, but in the end, it resulted in a tie. And I know, obviously, it left me very disappointed, especially with the way that it played out. Had it been the reverse, we'd probably feel a lot better about this tie, for what it means for this team. If it was a game that we all felt like we probably shouldn't have won and we didn't give away and found a way to tie, you'd probably feel a lot differently than you do today. But the fact that you viewed it as a game that we had locked up, and then it results in a tie, you're going to be really disappointed, as you should be. But from a playoff standpoint, it's not the end of the world. As a matter of fact, us tying Washington significantly upped the possibilities of us making the playoffs as opposed to a loss. And it probably, I'm not going to go as far to say equal because I'll explain throughout the video, but it's damn near close to equal as if we just won the game. And I'll explain that throughout the video. Also, before I jump into all these schedules and the standings in the NFC conference, I wanted to talk about the primetime game. That's right. In case you haven't heard, the New York Giants have been flexed to Sunday Night Football against the Washington Commanders in the rematch in just 2 short weeks. And, of course, we got a huge game this week against the Eagles, which I'm actually contemplating going to. We'll see. But a huge game this week against the Eagles, and then we go to Washington, in which they're coming off the bye. And now that game has been flexed to Sunday Night Football. And I think this is the second time we've been flexed in the last 3 years. 2020, I think we were flexed one of the last games of the season. I can't remember who it was against. It might have been the Rams. I can't recall. But we're going to be playing Sunday night against Washington. Why? Because the schedule makers see, clear as day, that's a playoff game. That's a playoff game between these two teams, and I cannot wait for that contest. But obviously, if we were ever able to upset the Eagles, which is going to be a very tall task, that would take a little bit of the pressure off that game for the New York Giants. But there's still going to be a lot of pressure going in, and you'll realize why as I go down the schedules and break down all the scenarios. But I am super excited about that. And one thing I've seen on social media since this has been swapped for the Sunday night game is everybody's going, oh, no, we never play good on Sunday night. Oh, no, Daniel Jones is 0-9 on Sunday night. And, yeah, we don't play good on Sunday night. We don't play good on primetime. But to me, just logically speaking, why do you think that is, guys? Why? It's not because we magically don't know how to play football on Sunday night and Monday night. It's because when you look at these opponents that Daniel Jones has gone up against, you go up against the best teams in football. And we've been one of the worst teams in football. So it only makes sense when you really go over this, why the New York Giants have been as bad as they've been, not just with Daniel Jones, but even before Daniel Jones on primetime, because the Giants have been a horrible football team. And that's why we don't get a lot of primetime games. But when we do get primetime games, generally speaking, you're going to be going up against some of the better teams in the NFL. So this is the primetime schedule with Daniel Jones. He's got an 0-9 record. But put it in context. He played the New England Patriots his first year as a rookie on the road. You remember the weather conditions in that game. It was like 40-mile-an-hour winds. I remember Brady didn't even look very good in that game. But, of course, he was a rookie going up against Bill Belichick. Then we played the Cowboys, who were a much better team than we were. They were a playoff team that year in his rookie year. The next year we played the Steelers, week 1, who had the best defense in the NFL to start the year, week 1. And I actually thought he played decent in that game. He threw the one really bad pick in the red zone, but without any support in that game, they stuffed Saquon Barkley the entire game, and they were a much better opponent than we were. Joe Judge's first game as a head coach, the pandemic, we had no preseason games. So you factor that in. Then he played the Eagles, and that game he actually played pretty well. I think that was the game where he fell. But he actually played pretty well in that game. But again, a much better team. Then we played the Buccaneers week 8. They won the Super Bowl that year, guys. And we lost by 2 points. And yes, did Daniel Jones make a bad throw here or there? Sure. But I don't think he played awful. He may have had an awful play here or there, but he was going up against the best team in the NFL with one of the worst teams in the NFL, right? Then you play Washington last year. He played really well in that game. And then he had the unfortunate circumstance of the drop ball by Slayton, Dexter Lawrence going offsides, even though I don't think he was. But regardless, it was called offsides. Obviously, it's a game we should have won. Then he played the Chiefs, okay? He played Pat Mahomes. I'm sorry. He didn't win that game. Then he played the Bucs, okay? A team that you saw destroy Jalen Hurts in the playoffs. Still a very good team. And then this year he played the Cowboys against Kupp. And we all remember what the offensive line and the defensive line looked like in that game, right? I think he was pressured 25 times. So to me, the whole primetime thing means nothing. I don't care if his record's 0-9. His record's 0-9 on primetime because he went up against like 4 Super Bowl champions. He went up against the Chiefs. He went up against the Bucs twice. Like, you're going up against Brady 2 times. You're going up against Pat Mahomes. Like, what do you think's going to happen when Daniel Jones has the pieces that he has on this football team? This will be a much more even matchup, and I am really excited. But obviously, we got to see what this team looks like when we get there. But I'm excited for primetime football. That game, everything's going to be on the line, much like this week. And the Giants did what they had to do from a playoff standpoint by getting that tie, because now that game against Washington is going to have the same effect as if it would had they beaten Washington the first time. The winner of that game is going to hold the tiebreaker when it comes to the playoffs. The reason it doesn't have quite the same effect because we tied, had we beaten Washington, and this is just for Washington specifically, for every other team when it comes to the playoffs, it has the equal effect as the win would have. And I'll explain that as we go over the teams. But just for Washington, it doesn't quite have the effect, but very close to the effect. Because even if we lose to the Eagles this week with Washington on the bye and we were to beat Washington, we'd essentially have a 2-game lead with 3 games to play. Had we beaten Washington the first time and then beaten them the second, even with a loss to Philadelphia, we would have had a 3-game lead with 3 games to play, essentially, even though it would have only been a 2-game league with the tiebreaker, meaning we could go 0-3 and they'd have to go 3-0 to surpass us with their remaining schedule. So that's the one minor difference due to the tie. But if we were able to beat Washington, we'd have a 2-game lead, including the tiebreaker, really 1, but it's 2 because of the tiebreaker, with 3 games remaining, and we'll go over Washington's remaining schedule after that. But what it really is going to boil down to is we're probably going to have to win 2 games, and one of them is going to have to be against Washington. There's actually a scenario that's at least moderately possible where we could get in if we just beat Washington, and we'll talk about that as well. Not that you should bank on that at all, but let's dive into it. First, we're going to look at the standings and the teams that you should be worried about as a New York Giants fan pertaining to the playoffs. The Eagles are a lock, so don't even think about them. They're going to win this division, and if they're not, the Cowboys are gonna. They have way too big of a lead, right? The Vikings are a lock. They're going to win the NFC North. The Cowboys are a lock for one of the wild card spots, so again, not of concern. Now, the NFC West is a little interesting because Jimmy Garoppolo went down yesterday with an injury. So I'll go over their schedule, and they play the Seahawks head-to-head. So if the Niners were to lose next week, and say Seattle were to lose as well, well, then suddenly the Giants are going to benefit one way or the other, whoever loses that game the following week. And I think that's the team that you root for to continue to lose going forward. But obviously, one of them has to win the West, and one of them has to compete for a wild card spot. But the 49ers at least entered the wild card discussion as a team that maybe could fall out of it due to the Jimmy Garoppolo injury. But I'm not banking on that because I still think they have one of the best well-rounded rosters in football, and they'll probably find a way to win at least 2 more games. Then you have Seattle. The other good thing about this tie, now Seattle can't beat us with a tiebreaker because of course Seattle beat us head-to-head, and Detroit beat us head-to-head, who you also have to be worried about just a little bit if you're a New York Giants fan. So they would have owned the tiebreaker had they finished with the same record as the New York Giants. Now, due to the fact that the New York Giants have a tie on their record, that will not happen. So that took away the tiebreaker. Had we lost, Seattle would actually already be ahead of us in the standings, and Detroit would only be really a game out, because if they were to gain 2 games on us, they would jump us due to the tiebreaker because they beat us head-to-head. So that tie was massive in terms of the playoff implications. Then you have Washington, and I'm not even worried about the Bucs because I think they're going to win the South. And you have the Lions. So for me, it's really 5 teams, I should say, competing for 3 spots because I'm only penciling in the Cowboys right now as a lock. I'm sorry, for 2 spots as a lock for a wild card. Either the Niners or the Seahawks are going to win the West. So one of them is going to make the playoffs. The other team is going to be competing for a wild card. So really look at it like it's only one of those 2 teams competing with us because one of them is going to win the division. So the NFC West loser, whether that be the Seahawks or the Niners, the Giants, Washington, and Detroit are competing for 2 spots down the stretch. And right now, the New York Giants are at 7-4-1. Washington's at 7-5. The Niners 8-4. Again, the leader in the West right now, but could fall off due to the Garoppolo injury. You got the Seahawks at 7-5, and you got Detroit at 5-7. Now let's put it into context. Let's go over each team's schedule. You got Washington. We're going to do them first. They only have 4 games left because they haven't had their bye yet. They're going to have their bye this week. Then they got 4 games left after that. Giants have to win that game against Washington. They could statistically and mathematically make the playoffs, especially if they were to beat the Eagles this week. Here's what I'll say. If they were to beat the Eagles this week, they can afford a Washington loss. But if they lose to the Eagles this week, there is no chance. Almost impossible for the Giants to make the playoffs if they lose to Washington with a loss to Philadelphia this week. If they beat Philadelphia this week, it opens up the possibility for them to make the playoffs, even if they lose to Washington. But if they lose to Philadelphia, that suddenly becomes a must-win game, right? Washington plays the New York Giants. Let's just say the Giants win that game, okay? Even if they were to lose to Philadelphia, they would essentially, like I said earlier, have a 2-game advantage on Washington. And then the Giants' remaining schedule after that would be the Colts, the Vikings, and the Eagles, the last game of the year where they will have the number 1 seed locked up, potentially could rest some of their starters. But we don't know that. We don't want to bank on that. And if the Giants were to at least beat the Colts, win 1 out of those last 3, which I think it's going to take, it would then force Washington to pass the Giants. They would have to go 3-0 over these remaining games. They also play the 49ers, who potentially could be falling back to the pack. So if they were to beat the 49ers, that could actually help the Giants. If the 49ers beat Washington, that would absolutely help the New York Giants. They play the Browns with now Deshaun Watson back, and they play the Cowboys the last week of the season. Again, much like the Eagles, that could be a game that means very little for Dallas. It could also be a game, if Dallas were to beat the Eagles, that means a whole lot for the Dallas Cowboys, where they're potentially competing for the division. So we don't know how that last week's going to play out. But if the Giants were to beat Washington and only win 1 out of their 3 remaining games, you would assume the best chance is the Colts. It would force Washington to go 3-0 over that stretch, even if we lose to the Eagles this week. So to me, if you beat Washington, that eliminates, for the most part, as long as you're able to beat 1 more game over your final 3, that eliminates Washington from being able to surpass the Giants. And there's really no reason in talking about these possibilities unless we factor in the Giants are going to win 2 games, because it's going to be very hard if they only win 1 game, being the Washington game. Because if we'll just talk about Washington before we get into the other teams. Let's just go back to Washington. If the New York Giants were only to win the Washington game, that would put them at 8-1. So even if Washington were to lose to the Giants, that would then give them the ability to win they'd have to win 2 out of their last 3 games. They wouldn't have to win all 3 to pass the Giants between the Browns, Cowboys, and Niners, which is still possible that they don't. They could certainly only go 1-2 over that stretch. So that's why I said there's still a possibility that the Giants could even get in if they only win the Washington game, because then they would need either Detroit or Seattle to finish behind them at that point. So there's actually a scenario where the Giants could get in at 8-1 as we go through it, but you don't want to bank on that. Obviously, you want to sew up the 9 wins. The next team we're going to talk about, the Seattle Seahawks. And the Seattle, of course, won yesterday. They're now at 7-5. Let's just go over the hypothetical scenario that the New York Giants get 2 wins, because like I said, that's probably the most realistic way that they're going to be able to get in. For Seattle to pass the Giants, they would have to go 3-2 over that stretch and get to 10-7. That's Carolina, that's the 49ers, that's the Chiefs, that's the Jets, and that's the Rams. And that's certainly doable. Carolina's not good. The Rams aren't very good, obviously, with their backup quarterback now. And the 49ers, and, look beatable. And even the Jets, who have played very well this year. That won't be a pushover game, but they're at home. You figure they stand a decent to good chance to win that game. So that's going to be tough. But like I said, the 49ers are another team you got to throw in here. They could potentially fall back to the pack, and they play one another. This is the 49ers schedule. And again, we'll see what this team looks like now without Jimmy Garoppolo. Purdy did a good job stepping in, but now teams are going to have a book on Purdy. You've seen this several times in the NFL. A lot of times a backup quarterback will step in for one game, whether it's Mike White with the Jets. Several quarterbacks in the past have stepped in for one game, looked really good. Teams get film on them, and then they make adjustments. So we'll see just how good Purdy and the 49ers look the rest of the way with 5 games remaining. But, of course, they got a lot of help there. They got a good defense. They got probably the best weapons in the league between Christian McCaffrey and, their wide receiver group and their tight end. So we'll see how they respond. But right now, the San Francisco 49ers are at 8-4. And if the Giants were to get to 9-7-1, which would be 2 wins, if 49ers went 1-4 down the stretch, the Giants would be ahead of them in the standings. And they play Seattle head-to-head. So let's say they lose that game, which would be bad for the Giants from a Seattle perspective, but good for the Giants from a 49ers perspective. They also play Washington. So the same thing, right? If they beat Washington, that's good. And if San Francisco starts to fall off, that could be good for us as well in terms of the wild card standings. So I think this week, if they lose to the Bucs, that's when you start to say maybe this team could fall back to the pack a bit. They play Tampa, then they play two teams that are also competing with the New York Giants for this wild card positioning with Seattle and Washington. Then they play at Las Vegas, who is a dangerous team regardless of their record. We've seen them win some games. And then the Cardinals, the last week of the season. So they're a tough team to predict because you don't know the effect that Jimmy Garoppolo is going to have being out in that lineup, right? You've looked at the 49ers in the past. When Garoppolo's gone down, they've really struggled. I remember the year after his first year there, he got hurt, and I think they only won 4 or 5 games the following year when a lot of people thought they'd be a playoff team. Then he came back, and I think they went to the Super Bowl the very next season. So we'll see the effect that Garoppolo has there, but that's at least a team that could potentially fall back to the pack. And then finally, you have the Detroit Lions. And, to put it quite simply, for the Lions to pass the Giants, if the Giants were to win 9 games, which would be 2 wins, one of which is probably going to have to include the Washington Commanders, they would have to go 5-0 during this stretch in a schedule that includes the Vikings, the Jets, the Panthers, the Bears, and the Packers again. Very unlikely. Now, if they beat the Vikings, I suppose it opens up a possibility. I think they've won 4 to their last 5. So Detroit is certainly playing well. And we saw that when they played the New York Giants. But if they lose to the Vikings this week at home, that kind of takes that possibility out of it. And even if, like I said earlier, if the Giants were to go 8-1, we'll go back to that possibility real quick. If the Giants were to go 8-1 and Washington were to only win 1 out of their last 3 games after that, they could still get in. If Detroit went, let me see, Detroit right now is 5-7, so they'd have to go 3-2. So a combination of Detroit going 3-2 and Washington going 1-2 over their last 3 games, if the New York Giants' only win was to be against Washington, would also get the New York Giants in, more than likely, as a wild card. So the playoffs for the Giants, as much as it sucks that we tied yesterday, took a huge upward trend in terms of a possibility. Had the Giants lost that game, I would have put their playoff odds probably at about 10 to 15%. Had they won it, I probably would have put it at 75%. With the tie, it's still close to 75% because, like I said, it now takes away all the tiebreakers with those other teams. So from that standpoint, it was as good as a win when you're comparing them to the Seahawks, when you're comparing them to the Lions. And the only minor hit it took was against the Washington Commanders, who we have to beat anyway. We were going to have to beat them even if we beat them the first time. The tie was pretty much, from a playoff standpoint, just as good of a win, rather. Had we won, I would have had it maybe at 70 to 75%. With the tie, I'll put it at like 65%. But the bottom line is you've got to beat Washington the second time around. If you don't, you're going to need some help. But the New York Giants are right in the thick of it, and it looks from looking at the schedules, even if the Giants start to lose to Washington, they're going to be playing meaningful football down the stretch. Obviously, they're going to have challenging games with the Vikings and the Eagles and the Colts their last 3 games, but they're going to be playing meaningful football down the stretch probably until the last week of the season, especially if they could win 1 game before that. If they have 8 wins going into the last week of the season, there's going to be some kind of mathematical possibility. More than likely, we can make the playoffs, even if we don't beat Washington. Say we beat the Colts, and then we got the Eagles the last game. There will be some kind of opportunity for the New York Giants to make the playoffs. So there's a good chance still, in my opinion. Obviously, the New York Giants got to get back healthy. Hopefully, we get McKinney back soon. I read some reports that it's at least trending that way today, but who knows? It could just be reports. It may not be, completely accurate. We'll see. But I know it hurts to hear this, I guess, for people that are very disappointed that we tied, as you should be. And it was a disappointing result, especially due to the fact that the New York Giants lost 2 games before that. They did what they had to do yesterday to help themselves in the playoff race. And what they did basically did exactly what it would have done had they won. The whole reason, for me at least, why that was a must-win game is because they had to get to that second Washington game to have the ability to own the tiebreaker, which would mean they'd have to sweep Washington. That was always their easiest path to the playoffs. That is still intact because they tied with Washington. Now, the winner of that game on Sunday Night Football is going to own the tiebreaker at the end of the season. Of course, the Philadelphia Eagles win will help the playoff odds tremendously. But if we don't win that, I would still put our playoff odds at about 60 to 65% going into that Washington game. That's going to be tough, but it's a game we could certainly win. That was a team yesterday. We should have been up by 10 points. We probably should have won that game by 10 points had Feliciano not had the penalty, but we'll never know. I thought the New York Giants outplayed them after the first quarter for the majority of that game. Of course, things kind of staled out there in the fourth quarter, but I definitely think they're a team we could stack up with. We'll worry about them, though, in 2 weeks. But I just want to get this up talking about the playoff possibilities. And as always, if you like what you watch, please subscribe, drop a comment, maybe give me a little thumbs up. Cheers.